Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on this blustery, wintry day. My name is Theresa Moran, and I'm the director of the Food Studies theme here at Ohio University. And I'm here tonight to speak with my colleague, Professor Art Trese from the Department of Environmental and Plant Biology, about our recent trip to Cuba. Art and I went to Cuba over a winter break with a group from Ohio University in order to conduct a reconnaissance for our study abroad programs.
Oh, he was talking to you, Lorraine.
No, I thought he was talking to us, so that's good. So, just to get started and set the scene a bit, Art and I, Art is a core member of the Food Studies theme. We were scouting study abroad sites to focus on urban sustainable food systems. And currently, about the past 10, 15 years, when you Google urban sustainable farming, the first thing that's going to come up is Cuba. And so we had been doing a fair amount of reading and talking to people, and the opportunity came to visit Cuba, and we jumped on it. I have here as the second slide two kind of quotes that in some ways sum up, at least for me, our time in Cuba. And the first is from Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother, younger not by much. Raul took the reins of the Cuban government in 2008. In 2010, he made this famous statement, either we change course or we sink. And that was widely interpreted as a lead up to some sort of change in the social system, and indeed there were changes at the margins. The other quote that kind of sums up, at least for me, my feelings about the time I spent in Cuba is, I have another Cuba, the one of my dreams. And this is a quote from one of the leading Cuban writers of the 20th century, Reinaldo Arenas. He's the author of Before Night Falls, which was made into a movie a number of years ago. He was an activist and tortured and imprisoned in Cuba for his homosexuality. And I think that all of us as Americans, we have a Cuba in our head, especially if you're of a certain generation, and the reality of Cuba and the dreams in your head, or the ideas in your head, there's a kind of a misalignment, I think, many Americans find traveling to Cuba.
And I would say, for my part, I've used a video that was shot by a community organization in Yellow Springs, Ohio, that went to Cuba in the early 2000s and published a video about agriculture and the crisis during the special period and how the people of Cuba figured out how to grow their own food. And I thought it was a really fascinating video. And so an opportunity to go to Cuba and see what was in this video, what I'd come to believe was part of Cuban culture, was really a wonderful opportunity. So we planned a trip there, in part to scout, as Theresa said, education abroad program we would like to offer students starting next spring semester. So we went to see what's available, how do we go about making that program happen. So we spent a week in Cuba. We were there with other faculty from Ohio University who were interested in other subjects, also looking at the possibility of putting together a study abroad program.
So we're going to start. We've just talked about why we decided to go to Cuba, and then we're going to move through the presentation saying what we saw, and this is what people told us when we were there, and then we are going to give some of our lasting impressions and, may I say, preliminary analysis, because we are not Cuba nor Latin American experts in any way.
Yes. So if you were hoping to find the sort of definitive explanation of what's going on in Cuba, it's not going to get it from us. We asked a lot of questions, learned a lot. But one of the things we found in Cuba is it depends on who you ask what the answer is. And even professionals at universities will give you some guarded some things they seem to be very open about, some things they're not as open about, and certainly if you ask the person who's driving your bus or the person on the street or the person at the market, you'll get answers that are in disagreement with what someone else has told you about Cuba. So it's somewhat difficult to come away with saying, I really understand what's going on, because not everyone agrees that the same thing is going on. I also want to say we're going to try to do this quickly, even though two people talking, we could be here for a long time, but we want to hopefully have room for you guys to ask questions at the end.
And I just want to, before we, okay, so here we have I want a visual image of Cuba. Anybody want to tell me where the Bay of Pigs is? Yes, thank you. I mean, very few Americans even know where the Bay of Pigs is. So to have this imagery of the Bay of Pigs in our mind, the fiasco, that and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's where it took place. So, and here is Guantanamo. So if you look at the map, you can understand the strategic importance of maintaining a naval and air presence on a Caribbean island. If you were following the news today, right, about President Obama wanting to not close Guantanamo, but remove the prisoners. I should just fill in one blank. The reason why Cuba is renowned for its, or has such good international press for its urban sustainable agriculture is because of a time called the Special Period in the Time of Peace, which was a term coined by Fidel Castro to explain the hardship that Cuba underwent with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So from 1989 to 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated, and that had an enormous, virtually overnight effect on Cuba by withdrawing all hard currency, all petroleum products, medicine. It was a profound effect on the society because they were so dependent on fossil fuels. So when you have no oil, your life changes overnight. And then from that period, Fidel Castro and the Castro government mandated organic agriculture. Mainly, let's be frank, they didn't have chemical and petroleum-based products.
We went to Havana, spent most of our time in Havana. We traveled west from Havana to that end of the island. We went as far as
Pinar del Rio, yeah.
Yep. And so most of the island we didn't travel to. It's fairly large, and travel in Cuba is challenging. It's all by bus. So anyway, just to give you an idea what small amount of Cuba we really saw. We're going to go through real quick, what do you guys know about Cuba, sort of what makes Cuba a unique place, a couple of sort of characteristics. So first thing, it would be like, how many people actually live in this island? Anybody?
Audience participation time. Make a guess.
Let me give you a clue. It's very...
8 million.
Thank you,
Not
Lori.
bad. Not bad.
A little high.
It's about the same as Ohio, actually, in terms of population. And it's also fairly close to Ohio in terms of land area. So we're talking about an area with, when we think about it as sort of geopolitical importance, it seems to be outsized versus the population that actually lives there, the 11 million people. And it is about 2.2 that live in Havana, so it's highly actually urbanized. How about the sort of thing that's often said in pride about Cuba?
95%.
Yeah, very high.
100%.
Almost. Very, very
As close
close.
as you can get.
There you go. We'll take 100% as rounded off. Yes. Yep.
It's actually higher than the United States.
Yep. And that comes in part from a free education system. And the free education system actually goes all the way through a PhD, so you can stay in school as long as you want, and the government covers the cost of that. So they have a very highly educated, not just a highly literate population, but lots of master's degrees, doctoral degrees, lots of specialty training, engineers, et cetera, in Cuba. And especially when you put it in comparison to the rest of the Caribbean islands and Latin America and South America.
And the, uniforms are required for schooling, and the color determines if you're in elementary, preschool, elementary, secondary, and technical school. And all the girls they're skirts, they're not skirts. So it enables, you're not, everybody knows a skirt, so it's not a skirt, it's a skirt.
Any idea about this, the healthcare system in Cuba? Rough idea?
You may have heard of,
Yes.
International for comprehensive health care. And they've done a lot of international work in the medical arena, gone far afield.
right, Angola,
Yep. Yeah.
other countries in Africa and Latin America.
Yep. So it's actually one of their exports. They export doctors in exchange for other goods and services, mostly goods from other countries.
And it's rather astonishing, 67.2 doctors per 10,000. And the United States, in comparison, has 24.5 doctors per 10,000 population.
And doctors earn essentially the same as other other people that work within the government sector, which is virtually the same as almost everybody else. There's very little distinction between different jobs, different employment. So there is no special wealth or special privilege to being a doctor. It's just you work in the community like teachers and other social services, et cetera.
Give a guess, come on.
Nick, what do you think? $500,000.
Oh, can you give us in a percentage of 11? That's too hard. Tell me a percentage.
It's very close. $500,000 gives you.
Yeah, that's close. It's 5.
5%, 's about what you said, $500,000. So about 5% have regular access to the internet. When we think about developed countries or high education, other things that Cuba has accomplished, this is one of the things that you would say is, they still sort of lag definitely in terms of a highly educated population that does not have access to the internet.
And the access to the internet that you do have is extremely expensive. So it's not that 5% is able to access the internet free of charge or at a nominal fee.
We thought we would just... Yes, if you're at the university. So, but...
You have a different percentage. You're talking about internet in your homes.
Yes.
Well, you couldn't own a computer prior to 2008. Owning computers, private computers were illegal.
Right, but through the universities, you have the medical schools.
Yes, but not the individual students, and it's not 24-hour access, and it's not open to everyone.
So is it the upfront cost of electricity, internet access, and like hardware that makes that number so low?
No.
It's
political. It's government control.
Yeah, it's partly just the access points for broadband, for Wi-Fi internet. So if you're at a hotel, you get a little card and you can log in for an hour. It costs you, depends on where you are, it costs you $2 to $7 an hour. And if you're a Cuban citizen, that is a week's salary for some people. So access to the internet it's limited physically and it's very limited economically. We just thought we would mention that the U.S. has had a long relationship with Cuba despite our diplomatic separation, et cetera, in terms of drug enforcement. The DEA often praises Cuba and their strict policies and penal code. It is also sort of related to this, considered to be one of the safest places to travel in all of the Caribbean and Latin America. So when we were there, it was clear, and we were often told, like, there is virtually very little crime. I would say
No guns.
No guns, yep. But this also relates to sort of their social policy. So social policy is that everyone earns the same amount of money. Everyone lives in fairly similar standards of housing. There's some variation, but it's not as if there are people who are very poor and people who are very wealthy. You would say, I'm willing to steal what they have, I want something that someone else has. It's like everybody has the same thing already. So underlying crime is sort of, I believe, is sort of related to that sense of equality.
And that's why the rising income disparity is a real challenge and for the Cuban government, and it will cause severe social disruption. So you can get death for, though I was unable to find any statistics of people actually being put to death because of drug violations, but it is on their penal code. And this includes marijuana, by the way.
So this is one of the things that Cuba is well known for, kind of be really unique in the world for having established at the beginning of their socialist economic planning was that they wanted to make sure that everybody on the island had adequate amount of food. And that rather than in other societies where if you're wealthy you can eat as much as you want or what you want and the poor are left to go hungry, the way they arranged that was just simply to have a ration card. And everyone in Cuba is given a ration card and it gives you a certain amount of food at about 10% of the market value. It's not typically free, but you can use your ration card, go into a store, and they will give you a certain allotment. So you get an allotment per month of basic staples. The ration card doesn't include everything you would want, obviously. It doesn't include fruits and vegetables. It includes your basic staples of some amount of meat, some amount of dairy, eggs, and usually beans or grains, depending on the season. But what these people are waiting to get into the store, so the ration cards are, you can go to state-run stores with your ration card and they will fill your ration card and check off what you've already taken from of your ration allotment. And so they're waiting. So another element of it is that there are a limited number of stores and it's a lot of time spent waiting for your little bit of allowed food.
And on another element of the ration card is that the amount of food that Cubans receive on the ration card has diminished over the years. So now the estimate is a ration card amount of food will last an individual about 10 days, and then, of course, depending upon consumption, and then the rest of the time that person or that family, each member of the family having a ration card, will need to purchase food in markets. It should be noted that Raul, again going back to our friend Raul also in 2011 said that while the ration card began as from really the motivation of egalitarianism, now in our current situation, the ration card is an unbearable burden on the economy and a disincentive to work. So, and as Art said, everyone in the society, even those who are receiving hard currency because of their jobs with tourism, receive a ration card. So there is, again, that's a sign of rising inequality, socioeconomic inequality.
Yeah, I was fascinated to talk to some people about ration cards, and this is what they said was, as more and more people in Cuba are allowed to start a small business and private enterprise, they make far more money than the average Cuban, and they still get ration cards. And so the government had proposed setting a threshold of income to say, well, if you make more than this, you no longer get a ration card. And they essentially had a referendum. And the people of Cuba said, no, we don't want to do that. We believe that the ration card represents an element of our social equality. And even if people don't need it, they should still get it. And ideally, they won't go and use it. They'll be like, I can live, I don't need this. But that would be their personal choice. They essentially, we don't want to go down the road of some people have this and some people don't, and we have to keep deciding who gets what and who doesn't. They were really still believed in the idea that everyone is the same, everyone gets treated the same, even though they're very aware that there are people who are doing much better in the society. There are people who are building personal wealth who can certainly purchase things and live a standard of living above the sort of typical for Cubans. What would you guess in American dollars? Wild idea. If you lived in Cuba, You have a job, you work for the government, how much do you take home a month?
And remember, you have a ration card, and you have free education, and you have free medical care, and a couple other things that will indicate.
But all this money has to come out of the government, right? You don't pay taxes.
And you don't pay taxes.
So this is somewhere the government's generating money and handing it out to everybody. They're not collecting some of that money, so.
I guess 50.
Yeah, $50.
Dollars.
$50, yeah.
$50 a month?
That's pretty good.
You'd be doing pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, you're on the high side, so. About $25, somewhere around that for most people who have a full-time job.
But we have to remember that your electricity and your water, your housing, your medical care, your education, you have a subsidy for the uniforms that your children wear to school. You have school supplies, limited and of a certain quality, that are also available on the ration card. So it's a very small amount of money, but we have to think of the larger picture. But this is in Cuban pesos, and that is where the problem starts to occur. Using dollars is illegal in Cuba, not like in the olden days when Americans would send dollar bills and have that operate on the black market. That's now illegal because that's been replaced.
Hello.
Come on.
Come on, it's right, there we go. Got it.
Okay, so there are two kinds of money. What we just showed you was the Cuban peso for Cubans. Cubans are paid in Cuban pesos. Foreigners, all foreigners use a parallel currency called the kook, and you can exchange your dollars or euro or whatever for kook at a hotel or at the airport, and the kook prices are much different than the coop prices with regard to restaurants and accommodation. However, you can use a kook to buy something for a peso, but you get your change back in pesos. So it just takes a little bit of maneuvering, but you can see that with $10, you can really have an impact on someone's monthly salary.
Remembering that you make about 500 pesos a month. So we were asking and trying to really get a sense of asking individuals, like, so how does that money get spent in your family? And what can you afford to go and buy when it comes to food? After your ration, once you've used up your rations, what else can you afford? And they were saying, for example, one pineapple is 15 pesos out of your 500 per month. So if you're a family and you have two earners, you might have substantially more than that, but now you have two people to feed, you have children to feed, and so you really end up, I would argue that what we found out was that people don't buy fruits and vegetables. Jumping ahead a little bit, but in reality, everything I saw was about how in Cuba, individuals had gone into their yard and planted onions and lettuce, and then there were these small urban gardens, and there was a whole sort of urban garden renewal during this special period. At that point in time, people were literally starving. They were well below the World Health Organization recommended calorie intake. And I would say they were really hungry, and what can you grow in your yard? You can't grow your own pig easily or your own chickens easily, but you have a little piece of land, you can grow some vegetables. And so people were living on what vegetables they could grow and what they were still able to get from their ration cards. As soon as they didn't have to do it, as soon as they weren't starving anymore, they went back to eating rice and chicken and rice and pork, whatever is on their ration card. We spent a lot of time walking around in Havana. Theresa and I were always like, no, we don't need a cab, we'll just walk. It's only 2 miles, 3 miles.
7?
7 miles?
Okay.
We've got 2 hours before we need to be there. Let's just walk through Cuba then. We'll see. And we kept looking, like, where's there at least a tomato plant or a little garden patch? Like, we saw virtually none. So the image that we had, like, oh, everybody and everywhere, every empty piece of land is being used to produce food. It is not.
The transition has already occurred, those times of stress where everyone needed to have some access to fresh food has sort of moved on, and now Cuba is facing additional kind of less easy to solve problems than growing a plot, tomatoes in a plot. So this is a view out of the hotel where all of us were in Havana. And then this is this is how the colonial architecture in some places is being restored. Now, this would be restored by someone with access to hard currency through remittances. Remittances were lifted. The ban on the amount on remittances, how much you can send to Cuba, was recently lifted, and Americans traveling to Cuba are allowed to bring up to $10,000 without declaring anything. So that's what there's a great influx of cash. And it's estimated, the State Department estimates, and we'll show you, we'll go down, do we have another? So, well, okay, so this is an example of what the more traditional walk through Havana is. But the State Department issues, it's between $1.4 and $2 billion worth of US dollars are channeled informally into Cuba to improve the life of Cuban relatives, such in building some of the places that we saw. But the World Bank estimates that that figure could be twice as much.
An interesting thing you would find in Cuba is every roof, every place that people can above where they live, big barrels to collect water. And that's I don't know if it's entirely just a relic or if it's still something they use, but during the special period and for years after that, electricity was kind of scattered and or intermittent. So running water was intermittent. So you would fill up a big barrel on the top of your building and then have a hose that ran into your where you live, so that if the city plumbing wasn't working, you still had water. And so they were everywhere. It's just part of the history of Cuba. This is just sort of an example where there are, I felt, some nice parts of this building. There's somebody working on the very top floor, and they've painted it beautifully, and then other parts of the building, very run down. It really is something to walk around Havana and realize how much money was put into building a beautiful city, and that 50 years ago it began to crumble, and there's been virtually no investment in the housing and the infrastructure in 50 years, and how apparent that is, especially when occasionally you see a place that somebody went in and has renovated it back to its original beautiful architecture.
And this is, so here we have, this is Plaza Vieja, which was renovated with EU money and I think some American money. It's astonishing. It's as beautiful as anything, I mean, that you would find in Spain or, you know, lots of Mediterranean style architecture. I mean, it's gorgeous. And right behind it is one of the buildings that we showed you in the previous slide. And here is a paladar, which is a home-based, it began as a home-based system of restaurants for, in the first openings of private enterprise. So the concept of home is very elastic. This is, was called Santa Barbara, I think this is and it was lovely and beautiful, and in some of them you can see the bathroom right there, so you know it was a home, or you go to the bathroom and there's a shower and a bathtub, so you say, yeah, this was a home.
Yep.
So, but those are in stark contrast to much of the city. And honestly, we, of course, as foreigners, we ate out for every meal, and I think maybe once or twice we noticed that there were Cubans at the restaurant that we were eating, and I don't know if they had the same menu with the same prices, because the prices that we paid were, I would say, on a par with something in a tourist restaurant in most parts of Italy, Spain, so not inexpensive.
We're going to try and speed up a little.
Oh, yes.
These are just one of the things Cuba is famous for around the world is at 1959 revolution. After that, no new cars come to Cuba for quite some time, and so people have managed to keep their, their classic cars running, and some of them have been refurbished and painted and made to look beautiful, and that's really a sort of a tourist use of them. So people with really nice classic cars will, ask, you want to ride around the city in my lovely car, and we'll take pictures of you, etc. There are many that are old cars that don't look that nice, and they all smoke terribly. The city...
It's leaded gas.
Right? It's leaded gas, and for a city with a small number of vehicles in it, is quite polluted with smog during the day.
The level of pollution was a surprise for, I think, most of us.
So this is what we really were interested in. Where do people in Cuba get food? So they go to the ration store. They can get some food there. And then there are markets, open air markets throughout the city. And what we were sort of anticipating is like almost every couple blocks you'd find another market attached to a garden or a small farm, and that was where people went and found their sustenance. We did find some markets. There certainly is food there. They were a lot fewer of them, at least in our walking around and our driving around all the time. We were looking for these, and we found some, spent some time at them. Quite surprised that there's sort of scarcity, I guess, is really what I had anticipated finding.
And Cubans use pounds instead of kilos, which, FYI, a colonial remnant.
So these are prices in pesos. So you get black beans. I think it's been kind of erased.
Yeah, the rice is $5, 5 coops, C-U-Ps, 5 pesos a pound.
So I think those are your staples, right? You can buy beans and rice at a pretty affordable price. 1 pineapple is 15. So you get 3 pounds of rice for the same price as a pineapple. And if you're hungry, or if you're on a limited budget and you're looking for food for your family, you're not going to buy lettuce, you're not going to buy a tomato or a pepper, you're going to buy rice and beans, or pasta or dairy products if you can get them, whatever it would be, maybe a little bit of meat. And we found that although there are fruits and vegetables for sale at these markets, I think they're out of the price range for your typical family who's shopping to feed a family for a week.
And so the next thing is raw sugar, and that's $6 a pound. And again, this is another list of prices and subsidized. We should go to the... And this was one of the markets that we found. We thought, wow, this is a really nice market. And when we mentioned it to the Cuban, the Havana, actually people were giving us a lecture that day. They said, oh, well, that's our equivalent of Whole Foods. And I thought, okay, well, that explains how beautiful everything was there.
So people who have paladars, who are making money in the tourist business, can afford to buy nice vegetables, might go here. A few other people, anyone who has managed somehow to come up with a significantly above average income. And they just sort of smirked at us, or like, oh yeah, that was not a market that Cubans go to. You were looking at something that's, kind of a novelty, that people with real money can go there. The other craziest thing was...
And the real money being the kook. Yeah.
Was Theresa pointed to one thing and said, is that a potato? And they said, no, that's not a potato. That's a white sweet potato. And a few minutes later, somebody comes up and goes, did you want potatoes? Did you want potatoes? Patata?
And I was like,
no, yes. And they're like, we have, just come around back here and
we'll
underneath we have some for you, but they're not for sale to the average person. So there is I mean, as visitors, we weren't told a lot about it, but it became kind of clear there's a whole second economy. We were told almost everybody does something on the side to earn a little bit more money, whatever it might be. They help with moving this, or they drive around, or they do something. There's a whole second layer of barter and various sorts of trade and income that you can do that helps you sort of just maintain your standard of living.
Potatoes used to be covered by the ration books, but potatoes were then removed from the ration books. And the paladars, the restaurants serving the foreigners, and the tourist industry is, of course, enormous. It's hard to explain the how many, Europeans from every nation. So those paladars buy the potatoes because, of course, the English tourist wants their fish and chips, and every other tourist wants to have potatoes. So there are no potatoes for sale.
They love their garlic. Every place that sells anything sells garlic, or sometimes just garlic. It's all over the place. We had something of an extraordinary conversation with someone who said, well, if you want chicken eggs, you can get chicken eggs, but you have to know somebody who knows somebody. Because when the truck comes into Havana loaded with chicken eggs, everybody will find a friend, or they'll go get a flat of chicken eggs, and then they'll tell somebody, and they'll tell somebody, and the truck is on this street at this corner. If you can get there in the next 5 minutes, you can buy some chicken eggs, and then the truck's gone. And there's just so many things that you have to know the right people, be in the right place. If you go to the grocery store, they may very well not have any eggs there today. So again, this is sort of an economy that runs sort of on the side, out of the main sort of numbers that you will ask when they sort of calculate how people live in Cuba. There are certainly people, this was again at 19MB, so this is, there are certainly,
Whole Foods.
Yep, farmers who are growing vegetables. We also asked a little bit about how farmers get their product to the market. I was fascinated by the answer that, there is no wholesaler, no distributor. So it's all direct market. Farmer grows food, has to get to the city to either someplace like this, and either they do it themselves, but they don't own cars, they don't own trucks. So they have to find somebody who will drive it into the city for them, and then they have to pay that somebody to run a stall and to collect the money, and then some of that, of course, goes back to the farmer. What the restaurant owners were really saying is you cannot run a restaurant where you say, well, I'm just going to call up Cisco or GFS and say, every week we want chickens, we want this much eggs, we want this much cheese, and it just shows up at your restaurant on a weekly basis. When you need food, you go to the grocery store or you go to the market and you purchase it all on your own, you bring it back to the restaurant, and the next day you're back out shopping for what's available and where can I find it. And that they're just, he was saying, if Cuba really wants to grow a tourist industry and provide food at restaurants, that you have to develop some sort of large-scale handling of food, and not every restaurant can send somebody out to fill up grocery carts and bags and stuff and bring it back into a kitchen every day and run an efficient system that way. So things that we take completely for granted are just not there in Cuba. Maybe we'll just skip.
Yeah, just go.
Yep.
Well,
just a couple pictures of what we did see in the way of farms.
Yes.
And animals.
This is a Cuban pony ride.
Yeah.
The number of oxen where you go, and instead of having a pony ride, there'd be an ox that a child could pay some money and ride on the ox.
Everywhere we went was where tourists were.
Yes.
We wanted to get out in the country and see the actual farms. And
this was 3.5 hours outside of Havana. We arrived there, and we were in the company of, thousands of Europeans, all staggered with their buses.
We were told we're going to go to a tobacco farm, and we'll talk to the tobacco farmer, and he'll show you the farm and the barn. You can talk all you want about tobacco and agriculture. Our big van comes up this long, muddy driveway, and as we get close to there's 4 big tour buses unloading Europeans, Caucasians standing around, and this guy very, very practiced at giving his spiel about it. It was
tobacco, yes.
There's nothing sort of authentic about this at all. We were like, can't we just get back on the van and go down the road and visit somebody who doesn't talk to tourists 12 hours a day? But we just wanted to say, if you're wondering how harsh was the transition, what was the special period? So this is real inflation adjusted wages prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then by 1992 and 93, we're down to that really works out to be about 10%, 15% of the prior to the special period real purchasing power of the average Cuban. And it has not recovered to the point where the way their society and their standard of living when the Soviet Union was essentially taking care of them is gone.
And then if you start in 1998 is when Fidel started the special relationship with Venezuela. And so Venezuela stepped in to subsidize the Cuban economy. And then, of course, we know now that Venezuela, of course, has collapsed. So this only goes to 2009, but Cuba is not falling off the charts yet because of the withdrawal of subsidies in Venezuela, because it's propped up with both remittances and this enormous boon in tourism. But it's a false economy because there's a layer of people who deal with the tourists, but the money, there's no trickle down to the average Cuban.
Just another way to look at it, if you look at when we think about food, and we were there mostly interested in what do people eat and where does their food come from, and all this notion of organic agriculture has created a sustainable system that feeds an island of 11 million people. And the reality is, A, that in the special period, the average Cuban, it is said, lost 20 pounds, and we heard that number cited a number of different times. They were eating below what was considered a sort of the anticipated or ideal calorie intake. That's the calorie intake of Americans, and that's the calorie intake. So there's still...
So there's, you know, they're eating over 3,200 calories a day. So if they're eating over 3,200 calories a day, where's that food coming from?
Good question.
Good question.
And we didn't see the farms, and we didn't see the markets.
So
and
where the heck's that food coming from?
How's it getting there?
And how come our plates are always full of chicken?
We ate a lot of chicken.
Never eaten so much chicken in my life. And where was my chicken coming from? The United States of America. Yes, 77% of all chicken imported into Cuba is from the United States.
And
frozen.
Admittedly, we went there being a bit naive once we were there for a week. It's like, wow, when we came here, we really didn't know. Because when somebody told us, like, where does this chicken come from? And somebody said, that's from the chicken boat. We're like, the chicken boat? I'm like, yeah, the chicken boat comes all the time and just comes into the port and unloads chicken. And then a few days later, there's another big barge, you know, a big international shipping boat arrives with chicken. From where? It's like, well, as Theresa likes to say, from Iowa or Delaware or somewhere in the United States. Yeah. Processed packaged chicken is what feeds the people of Cuba their meat.
And so when asking the question, where does the food come from, is not a question that has a straightforward answer. Even when you go to a farm where you are having a farm to table meal, when you know that the elements required, the agricultural inputs to get that food to your table, and that restaurant is serving 500, 600, 700 people every week, the agricultural inputs are not there. And I mean like fertilizer, I mean animals that they slaughter, they're just, so it's coming from someplace else.
Yeah, so there's a bit of, I would say, even when we were there, a bit of greenwashing about the whole thing. So we went to a farm that they had raised beds and they had stuff, and then, but it was just tourist after tourist, bus after bus of people coming. They had added a couple like ancillary restaurants with places for seating just to handle the crowd. And they would say, you know, this is why the farm is here, so that we can grow food. And you're like, you're not feeding even a tiny fraction of the people that come here every day from this farm. You've got some beds of lettuce and a little bit of scrawny broccoli and a little bit over there. It looks nice, but we know that you are buying food from someplace. That's what we're sitting down to eat. It was a big, far more than we could eat. Another thing is like
always given more than you could possibly eat. And so what we found out is that the figure is between 65 and 80% of food consumed in Cuba is imported. Okay, 65 to 80. That's a huge range, and you know it depends by again who you speak to, what number you get in that range. But they spend over $2 billion a year importing food in a country that has very little currency to spend. And so they look for countries that will give, the Cuban government gets favorable terms of trade from a number of countries to import some of these products. For example, rice. A lot of the rice comes from Vietnam because Vietnam gives a favorable terms of trade to Cuba, so they extend credit for Cuba to purchase its rice. The same with wheat from Argentina. The poultry products here in this, that's mostly the United States. And here we can show that United States agriculture exports actually did decline somewhat. But when we were there, Secretary, what's his name? Vilsack had just returned from the United States. He had just brought a delegation of governors, that's the Secretary of Agriculture, and you know, everyone. He's had 4 or 5 trips to Cuba in the past 16 months, I think, or 18 months.
Really working on increasing trade. I mean, I don't know the details, how much they're working on trying to improve Cuba's own agriculture, but it would appear sort of the main emphasis of the United States is, can we take some more of this market? Can we figure out a way to sell you more of what we're producing here? Just real quickly, this is roots and tubers, and this is
Vegetables.
Yep, vegetables in tons. And then we have the staples here. I've also seen other data, so I guess it depends on how you measure all of this, that there's actually very little vegetables produced in Cuba. It was higher in the early 2000s, and it's gone down some since then, without dwelling on that for too long. I think the last sort of major point we'd make before we open up for questions is, it's not that Cuba doesn't have land area. Cuba has a lot of available land, actually. We were told by a Cuban economist, agricultural economist, that about 30% of Cuba could be farmed but isn't being farmed now because they don't have people who want to do it. It was pointed out that if you have a very highly educated population, and if farming is not a way to make any more money than any other job you might have, farming is hard work, and it's hot, and it's, you know, it's not glamorous. And so it's hard to take somebody who's got an engineering degree and convince them to go farming. If they can find some other job, even if it's not engineering, something else that they can do for 8 hours a day and get their pay. And so there just aren't a lot of Cubans who want to go out and farm. And so while the land's available, the reality is that they are not producing their own food. The government's frustrated by the fact they can't increase food production. They're looking at changing policies to try and resurrect, I guess, or rebuild some of their agriculture, rather than what I certainly went there anticipating to find. We found something quite different today in 2016.
This is just to show you the urbanity of urban focus of the Cuban population. It's about the same as the United States, and you think with the United States rural population, we produce an enormous amount of food that's with efficient or industrial agriculture, but Cuba is lacking agricultural inputs and then a cultural, as it was explained to us, that there's no desire to return to the land. For example, in Americans, you want to own some land, you want to go out west, and that agricultural work is associated, of course, with the plantation system, with slavery, and with sugarcane, and those are not things that anyone really wants to spend their life doing. And the risk factor, of course, is enormous in farming. So this is just another example of a renovated, beautiful courtyard in Havana, what the whole place could look like with time and money.
It just doesn't seem that Cuba's going to build it themselves. The scary thing for the
Yes.
people of Cuba is we are very, very poor. We would love to build our economy ourselves, but we don't see that happening. It doesn't seem to be. So Cuba's opening up for international investment with all of the concerns about what does that mean when other other countries come in and build things and run things. What happens to the Cuban people and their essentially their cultural identity, but also just there's who runs the country. In other words, can they maintain control of the country the way they have if they open it up to investment from big concerns whether it's McDonald's
KFC.
or it's what is the big hotel and gambling casinos that are in the Bahamas. You know, will it become just another tourist destination surrounded by poverty? This is really not what they want.
And to leave you with one question, as was posed to, as was discussed when we were there, the Cuban Revolution fostered a social contract. The people that stayed, for the majority, agreed that egalitarianism was worth any personal sacrifice in not accumulating personal wealth. But that social contract has really been undone over the past 20 years with the fact that the USSR could no longer prop up the economy, and with the opening to tourism and the tremendous inflow of cash. So with this rising social and economic inequality, really what is the social contract of the Cuban government going to be based on? And that is the question, I think, that keeps all the octogenarians who run Cuba up late at night. So I think now we'll just open it up for questions. What do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You get any feel for what the agricultural science infrastructure is in Cuba?
I think it's quite good.
Yeah.
I think they're very well trained. I think they don't, what strikes me is that they don't buy the inputs and then apply them to increase Cuban agricultural productivity. They are buying some, but it seems that they're spending a lot more money, $2 billion a year to import food, rather than spending $500 million to import fertilizer. And Brazil right now, though, is investing substantially in modernizing, if you will, or industrializing some parts of Cuban agriculture. But I would say in terms of knowledge about plant breeding and animal husbandry, I think the skill is there. I would just to go off a little bit, what happened in Cuba when the government took over all property, they have now said we will allow individuals to own, well, to have their own private enterprise farm, in other words. So you can now get some government land and you can farm it, but it's never your land. So then you ask, well, what's the incentive to go and build a house and a barn and do all of that if I don't really own the property? What if, for example, I get sick and I have to leave the farm? I can't sell the land and the buildings. They said that it's not clear that you could ever sell the buildings. You've made all that lifetime investment and it's not really yours. So I think that's another element of like the reluctance of people to go and take this empty idle land and turn it into agricultural productive system is like you're investing a whole lot of sweat equity that you may never get out of it again. You are allowed, the current policy is we will allow you to give that land, that farm to your children if you choose, but it still won't be yours to say I built it and now I want to sell it and take the cash and do something else with it. It's like you're really, anyway, you get the idea.
I can understand why they would do that, because then you have people coming in from other countries and buying up Cuban land. I mean, is that one of the reasons?
Foreigners can't buy, individual foreigners. Now, the major hotel chains and resort chains have special agreements for their mega resort. There's a mega resort strip where all the foreigners fly into, all the Europeans, it's cheaper than going to Thailand, so they fly to Cuba. And that's a special ownership arrangement. But land ownership is becoming, you can own a house or any property that you owned prior to 1959.
What that really means, you can live in it. And you can say, I own it, but you're not really allowed to just say, well, I want to sell it. There is no real estate market, at least we were told.
Yes.
You can't say, I added a porch and I did this and I really made my house nice, so I want to sell it and get that money back. Somehow it's like, what they said you can do is you can trade a house with somebody else. Like you're allowed to move, but you have to find somebody who wants to trade houses with you. So you technically have guaranteed housing was what you were, or if you are assigned a unit in state housing, like that's yours, stay there. But there's no incentive, even if you have cash, traditionally there hasn't been, like to upgrade it, other than for your own personal good. But the way we always think about it, if I remodel my kitchen, I figure out, am I going to do it and what's the resale value of the remodeled kitchen as part of my calculation? But there isn't any such thing in Cuba. So people often just this is my house, and I just keep it livable, and it may be crumbling, but I don't really know how, I don't have much money, and I'm not going to invest in making it more beautiful necessarily.
We did find people that owned animals, and they're like pigs and chickens, and sold pigs and chickens, and that income actually propelled them and their families to be able to purchase other items. So it was an interest. They didn't own land that the pigs were on, but the pig producing a litter, that was, a cash flow. Sorry.
But
a lot of that came from Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries that were pushed out of Latin America into actually Mexico, and from there they moved to Cuba to join Fidel, and they were all had ideas of communism or not socialism. And so when they pushed all the casinos out and all the oligarchies out, and they replaced it with a system that you see where they share and all the, and that's where the social contracting of it.
Mm-hmm.
But now I see some problems with them opening the doors back up, because they're going to have some of those same old problems going to happen all over again.
Yep.
Casinos, investment hotel chains. Yes, some people are going to profit, but again, back to agriculture, we have some similar problems here in the United States. Our large-scale agriculture is heavily subsidized. They can't subsidize agriculture because they're communists. Yeah. But the small farmers, the family farmers who still exist in this country, are starved out. If we don't do something, I see, we need to help the Cubans. We also need to help ourselves. We need to sustain our small agriculture, small farm economy.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that really struck me was when talking about the revolution and how Cuba came to have such equality across society, was someone said, well, unlike other communist revolutions where the leaders of the revolution eventually accumulate wealth and live in really nice houses, and they essentially build for themselves something that they're not offering everyone else. But in Cuba, basically the ministers and whatever rank you were, those people lived pretty much like everyone else, and that made a stable, generational acceptance that we're poor, but we're all poor, and we're all in it together, and there aren't people. I'm not poor because somebody else took what I could have had, and they're living in this beautiful mansion. But now they're frustrated. I think that's the sort of key, was that this generation, the young generation, isn't buying into this, that we're all poor, so that's fine.
I mean, I saw more Michael Kors bags walking down the street. When I was walking down the street, I was astonished. But Michael Kors bags in Cuban women, and it was shocking. And those are Cuban women that got it through remittances. And not everyone can have a Michael Kors bag. I don't have a Michael Kors bag. What is a Michael Kors bag? Oh, so it's a status symbol here in the United States. And also the idea, we're the genie's out of the bottle. The fact that so few people have internet access, and that the internet access costs so much. The young people, it was astonishing. They can only go and have access to the internet for limited hours in limited places at a very high cost, and to even buy a tablet or to buy a phone, it's extremely expensive. And so you're watching your YouTube, or you can't get YouTube in Cuba. You're doing your Facebook, you can do Facebook. You're Skyping with your relatives, and all of a sudden the government says, oh, time's up. That cannot continue. I mean, the young people of Cuba see the tourists that come, and the young Americans, and the young British, and the young French, and the young Italians. They don't want that kind of life. There's no investment, there's no political investment in maintaining the social structure and the political structure of Cuba, because it's a disincentive to living a life in a global world. Yeah.
We talked to I'm sorry, someone who was finishing his PhD. We weren't there, but the other faculty were like asked, so what is your hope for your life and your hope for Cuba? And he said was to get out of here, to leave. Like, really? He's like, yeah. I have a PhD, but I will never earn any money with it. Like, I've worked hard, I've studied, and I have a PhD, but it will never benefit me here in Cuba, you know. And I know that my training, whether I'm a doctor or a PhD or an engineer, that could build me a standard of living anywhere else in the world that I'll never achieve in Cuba under the current. So I think there's a whole generation that's now like, this just doesn't work for me. I want to either get out of here, or I want this. I want
something different. Yeah.
They would be like, "Would you like a capitalist system?" And they'd be like, "Yeah," because then I can earn how hard I work. And the people that don't work hard, which is plenty of people in Cuba, then they don't deserve to have the same standard of living if I do if I'm working harder. So this is what we see as the trade-off between a society of
Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
I just, I went to Cuba about 6 or 7 years ago, and I was there to look at agriculture from a planning perspective, and my experience just that many years prior was quite different from what you're talking about now, and it was quite close in terms of tourism, readily from Europe, but really not. It was complicated to get there, and it was very complicated to be there for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it has. That is. So what we were reading and everything. Really, there was a 5-10 year lag, because, no other word but the genie's out of the bottle. There are planes flying in from Spain 3, 4, 5 times a day. People from all over, and the inundation. There's no infrastructure for tourism, and yet the tourists keep coming. So it has really changed. And of course, Venezuela was still subsidizing Cuba.
And China as well.
Yeah, so it's been a transition.
One other point to make specifically about the gardens there, which is what I went to look at, and I literally took some books and some maps, and we just wandered around until we found something, and then somebody told us to go here, and then we went on 6 buses and we got there, and there was quite a bit of infrastructure still in place. The subsidy that was put in place was that the government built the gardens and hired the people. So in a similar way to how we look at, walking into a farm that's pre-set up, that's how all the urban agriculture that I looked at was set up, and it was robust. I mean, that certainly wouldn't feed Cuba, but it was still alive and well in such a way that, we were able to look at quite a lot of gardens that were functioning.
Yeah, I think if you just were to measure like the total output of those gardens versus the population in the city, that and how it's available, because we kept hearing, and I don't know if it's more now than then, but that vegetables are just too expensive. You can't afford fruits and vegetables, and they're on the verge of having like major protests about what food costs and what they can afford and what should.
We were there the first week, so we were there. We came back January 11th, and January 16th, street vendors were outlawed. Fruit and vegetable street vendors were outlawed because of the perception of too high food prices. And that was like the attempt to have entrepreneurship, again, taking them from people coming in from driving to the farms, bringing things in. but the prices were too high and they were outlawed. And I don't know what's taken that place except the market situation. But also, if you don't get to the market at a certain time of day, everything is gone. We'd love to hear about your experiences.
We
Yes.
definitely drove by them, and they're still there.
Altamar, did you go to
they were-
Montemar and Altamar?
I can't remember
Okay.
the names now, but, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I got here late because I had understood the time wrong, so I apologize if you've already talked about this, but a movie had come out a while back about how Cuba coped with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and, you know, was all these gardens and, you know, people growing things in
That's the
plastic
Yellow
bags on
Springs,
their fences.
Yeah.
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 You know, they presented it as being really pretty extensive in the city. So all of that just kind of, or a lot of that just collapsed. I mean, people still have to eat, so what happened to that?
Or was that propaganda to begin with?
Partly. I mean, in that video, they talk about that they make a claim that 50% of the fruits and vegetables consumed in Havana were produced within the Havana and the neighboring, suburbs, I guess, provinces. Which may be 50% of the fruits and vegetables. It may be true at that time. And they still may produce a substantial amount, but I don't think people eat very many fruits and vegetables. I think they can't afford it. There's like, you eat what you can. You first buy calories. Fruits and vegetables are a luxury. In reality, if you ask the impoverished in America, it's like, how many fruits and vegetables I can't afford it. I have to first have 2,500 calories on my plate, and then I can eat a salad after that. But
And you mentioned rooftop water collection, but you didn't see rooftop gardens. You didn't see.
and we went
Well,
to
we
some
did-
places that had talked about that they used to do it.
They
and-
used to, that we had met many people who said, "Oh yes, I had, that was then." Because they don't need to, and they have a job that requires them. One was the bus, the interpreter on one of the buses. We went with an organization called Food First. Yes, we went with which is again renowned for its food sovereignty tours. We spent 2 days with them, and so the translator, who was incredibly well educated. Again, we cannot say enough about the level of education in Cuba is phenomenal. And he said, "Oh yes, I had a garden. Everybody I knew had a garden. We grew what we could. Onions was repeatedly mentioned, but now he's working a tour bus all year round and making lots of money. I mean, we gave him a tip, just Art and me, that was more than the monthly salary, and we were the only, everybody gave him the same amount, and there were 30 people on the tour. So why in the world would you need to grow vegetables?"
But it wasn't just him.
It wasn't just him.
He was
yeah.
just saying
That's-
people aren't doing it
people,
anymore.
yeah,
They don't
it's
feel
kind of
like.
indicative of a change, of really of the transition that Cuba is undergoing is enormous. And at all levels. I mean, the government is not unaware of it. In the Food First tour, one of the speakers said, "We can't wait till we can buy soya from Illinois." And everyone on the tour, a lot of American academics, said, "Oh no, you don't want to do that." And the reaction was, "Oh, again, you're going to tell us what we want. We want KFC." "Oh no, you don't want KFC." Again, it was a real, that's what I'm saying, the Cuba of the dreams. We can't impose, on them. And I don't know if there's no discussion of extending credit for agricultural products yet. So I don't know if they'll continue to divert agricultural imports to other nations that extend favorable terms of credit. Should we have a, sorry?
Yeah.
The grass is always
Yes,
green.
there is that. Well, it's our.
It's
I know.
safe.
I had this little vision that this is my son Martin, when he watched this video that you're talking about. It was like, oh, I said, "What did you think about it, Martin?" He said, "I think I'd like to live in Cuba." And then we went there, and it's like, no, you wouldn't. No, not really.
I've always wanted to live in Cuba, my whole life.
The
Yeah.
people are wonderful,
Yeah.
you know, but it is
And music all over,
very, very
all
important.
over. Janet?
So with the lack of eating fruits and vegetables, has that had a health impact? I thought they had a good life expectancy.
Yes, they've got a fantastic life expectancy. This is the fascinating thing. When you look up Cuba and the effects of the special time, so that is again from the special time is actually a 20-year period. In that 20-year period, because of the reduction, the enormous reduction in calories, but also the fact that everybody had to walk everywhere, okay, or ride a bike, or ride a horse, or use an oxen to plow, they had improved health outcomes in terms of diabetes and in terms of heart disease. Fantastic, enormous, and that's all of it. However, since 2010, actually I think a little bit before, there has been indications that all that weight has been regained. So the 20 pound per person has been regained. And I would say plus, I was surprised. No one seemed to me, it was not a general population of slim people. And what the fantastic Cuban medical institutions have, what the item that they're trying to get on the international market is a treatment for diabetes, because they predict a surge in diabetes in Cuba. Because you saw the price of sugar. Sugar is really cheap compared to anything else. Yeah. So they've put this enormous amount of emphasis on finding treatment for diabetes, and they want to sell that internationally. Yes.
And just to say, you guys are all welcome to leave anytime you want
Yes,
to.
yes,
So
and we could go and have some bread and cheese and a glass of wine next door, but let's take one more question.
So who's keeping then like the vegetable markets alive, like the Whole Foods market or whatever? Who is shopping there?
At the Whole Foods, it was the paladars, all the restaurants in Cuba, restaurants in Havana that are for the international market. They go and buy whatever they need. And the Cubans that have access to cooks, for example, the translator on our bus, who was making a fortune.
So if you work in a hotel, if you anywhere that foreigners spend a little bit of money, those people then can go and spend at the Whole Foods market.
And there's like enough people and so
Yes.
Oh, that's the problem, that they're growing by the day.
Okay.
So we met young people who spoke English, and we said, well, how did you learn to speak English? And they said, well, our parents did everything to give us private lessons to speak English because they wanted us to work in a restaurant with foreigners, because you get tips in kooks, and kooks are the money of foreigners with this enormous value versus the Cuban peso. So people will make sacrifices to get a job where you can earn a kook. I love saying that word, kook. Yeah.
So didn't incentive we put on to buy more fruits and vegetables and thereby
Subsidize, sure. Yes.
The cost
Yeah.
for farmers?
Oh.
Would that
No, you mean a subsidy for the consumer. But fruits and vegetables have never been on the ration card. Can you imagine? Never. That tells you something. Is that what you meant by subsidies?
Yeah, if it could be jump-started and lower the cost of production for farmers, which would lower the all-around cost of produce.
Well, the primary cost is labor. I mean, the real cost of producing of lettuce and peppers, et cetera, is the hours of labor it requires. And so there are state-run farms, and they produce some vegetables which come into the cities. And so I don't want to imply like people never touch vegetables, but it's not what we had envisioned. And like in this, how Cuba survived the peak oils. that had become a major part of every plate. Or, they don't have the money, really. I mean, if you can only pay an average labor worker in the city $25 a month, I feel like then to take some of that money and pay farmers more, in other words, subsidize farming as a particular industry, would cause a lot of problems for the government, so they're reluctant to do it that way.
So one last question. Since you went there and you had this vision and you kind of got deflated a little bit, you had time to reflect on it, then you went to develop a relationship. What is that relationship going to be for OU and botany and food preservation and Cuba? How are you going to interact?
Well, we actually weren't building relationships directly with the university or with any institutes of education, because that actually you are not permitted to visit schools, universities, or hospitals. Our relationship in Cuba is through an international provider called, and that's what we went to see, because there are a number of international providers with study abroad programs. And we selected API, which has a long history of programs in Spain and throughout the world. So that's the institutional pathway. I want to go back now that I'm not living in my dream world. But I tell you, it is very, I don't know what's going to happen there. We didn't even talk about the sex trade. So, I mean, it's the new Phuket, you know, it's the new Thailand. But the students that were there, the American students that were there on study abroad programs from St. Olaf's and University of Minnesota, Texas A&M, Michigan State, they all loved their time there, loved it.
We weren't really there on a sort of a people-to-people exchange. We were there looking, can we have access to examples of their agriculture, and particularly their urban agriculture, and both from the consumer end and the marketing part and where the production is. So we have worked out a program for students next spring break. So that really was our intention, to go back. And what we really want to do in our program is look at urban agriculture in Ohio, Cleveland or Steubenville, places where in our cities where we're attempting to build at least a small element of urban agriculture. And we thought Cuba would be the greatest place to go and look at, well, how can you do it in a big city and feed people, you know? So then it's like, oh, yeah. Ration cards, yes. Ration cards, and get some chicken from Iowa and you're all set. Yeah. So, but we will, that is the plan, to go back with students. And, but, you know, now I think we have a better idea of like, what are we really going to find there, and how are we going to compare that to what's going on in the States?
I mean, it would be a fantastic example for any student, because you can feel the transition in the society day by day. It's phenomenal. Go to Switzerland. Yeah, well, it's a little hard on spring break to get over and back. But anyway, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We have